What's good? What's good? I pulled out of my storage unit this book because it's been on my mind lately. Psychohistory, or varieties of psychohistory. This is exactly why it is important to retain physical books, especially older physical books, because we are witnessing with digital technologies the rewriting of history and the rewriting of present reality in real time. And older books preserve I don't want to say maybe more, theoretically a more historically accurate perception of events. However, you also have to consider that history is written by the victors, right? And so even though we have these old texts, we should try to read them through the lens of the victors of the era. I know that's a lot. This particular subject is hotly debated and contested. And I believe that we need to address it. We really need to address it, because I'm growing concerned with the rise of anti-Semitism. It's I'm seeing a lot of people questioning things like the Holocaust, and I'm a conspiracy theorist, but that one I just I struggle with that one. And I think we need to have an honest conversation to prevent future violence. What am I talking about? The Nazis and socialism. History tells us that the Nazis were socialists. The party name was the National Socialists, the Nazi Party. And I don't want to say many historians, but modern historians who are trying to rewrite history to avoid any association to socialism and Nazism, to avoid any association there, they're trying to ignore that reality. And so I just want to do a little brief reading from this book. This chapter is the Psychohistorical Origins of the Nazi Youth Cohort. And so, this is just really interesting because we're seeing it again. Peter Lowenberg, a young historian with training both in history and psychoanalysis, elucidates the traumatic events experienced by a whole generation of Germans who were children or adolescents during World War I. His thesis is that the experiences of this generation predisposed many of them to become followers of National Socialism. If a common shared experience of the trenches united most of the top leadership of National Socialism, the followers, broadly speaking, those born around 1900, were united by a common set of childhood traumas. These included food deprivation, absence of the father who later returned in defeat, and unstable social conditions after the war, which made normal life difficult. In addition to its importance as a substantive history, Lowenberg's article represents a major methodological advance because its treatment of a whole generation as the object of study. The historical relationship between the events of World War I and its catastrophic aftermath in Central Europe and the rise of National Socialism has often been postulated. The causal relationship is usually drawn from the savagery of trench warfare on the Western Front, the bitterness of defeat and revolution, to the spectacular series of National Socialist electoral victories beginning in 1930, as if such relationship were historically self-evident. It is the thesis of this paper that the relationship between the period from 1914 to 1920 and the rise and triumph of National Socialism from 1929 to 1935 is specifically generational. The war and post-war experiences of the small children and youth of World War I explicitly conditioned the nature and success of National Socialism. The new adults who became politically effective after 1929 and who filled the ranks of the SA and other parliamentary party organizations such as the Hitler Jugend and Bund Düstermarsch, I don't speak German, Madchen, were the children socialized in the First World War. This essay examines what happened to the members of this generation in their decisive period of character development, particularly in early childhood, and studies their common experiences in childhood, in psychosexual development, and in political socialization that led to similar fixations and distortions of adult character. The specific factors that conditioned this generation include the prolonged absence of the parents, the return of the father in defeat, extreme hunger and privation, and a national defeat in war, which meant the loss of prevailing political authority and left no viable replacement with which to identify. Most explanations for the rise of National Socialism stress elements of continuity in German history. These explanations point to a political, intellectual, social, diplomatic, military, and economic factors, all of which are important and none of which should be ignored. The historian and social scientist studying Nazism should be conversant with and well-versed in these categories of explanation. The study of political leadership is also of unquestioned importance for the understanding of the dynamics of totalitarianism, and it should be intensely developed by historians as an approach to that understanding. This essay, however, will focus not on the leader, but on the followers, not on the charismatic figure, but rather on the masses who endow him with special superhuman qualities. It will apply psychoanalytic perceptions to the problem of National Socialism in German history in order to consider the issues of change rather than continuity in history. On the ego, to deal with, let me go back a little bit. It will apply psychoanalytic perceptions to the problem of National Socialism in German history in order to consider the issues of change rather than continuity in history, to deal with social groups rather than individual biography, and to focus on the ego-psychological processes of adaptation to the historical, political, and socioeconomic context, rather than on the instinctual biological drives that all men share. No genuine historical understanding is possible without the perspective of self-understanding from which the historian can then move forth to deal with historical material. Likewise, there can be no measure of historical understanding if we research what men said and did, and fail to understand why they acted. The 20th century has experienced the gross magnification of political and personal irrationality correlative to the exponential increment in the power of modern technology. That was just a cool sentence. No history will speak with relevance or accuracy to the contemporary human condition if it fails to assess realistically the profound capacity of the irrational to move men. Trump derangement syndrome. Great example of that. Psychoanalysts are concerned with many things that are relevant to the historical problem of what happens to children in a nation at war. They have studied the effects of separation from parents and have seen the long-term consequences of deprivation, material and emotional. They know the hows and whys of a child's identification with his parents. Above all, psychoanalysis as a clinical technique of investigation demonstrates that only the smallest part of human thought and conduct is rational. The world of disembodied minds acting in an emotional vacuum has no place in a psychoanalytically informed history. Too much of history is still written as though men had no feelings, no childhood, and no bodily senses. What is needed is a new kind of history, a history that tells us how men responded to and felt about the great political and economic events that shaped their lives, a history that gives due place to the irrational, the unconscious, and the emotions not only of men, but also of the child in the man. Oh man, this is good. It's also making me think of Karl Marx and material dialecticism, and how material conditions sort of dominate the evolution and the consciousness of man, he's so wrong in that, because the unconscious and the emotions and then the bodily sensations, being a human is so much more than just material reality and material conditions. Okay, let me get back to it. This new kind of history requires an understanding of the dual and related concepts of fixation and regression. Sigmund Freud, in a demographic metaphor of migration, once compared human development to the progress of a people through new territory. At those points where resistance is greatest and conflict most intense, the people will leave behind its strongest detachments and move on. If the advanced parties, now reduced in strength, should suffer defeat or come up against a superior enemy, they will retreat to former stopping places where support stands ready. But, says Freud, they will also be in greater danger of being defeated the more of their number they have left behind on their migration. Thus, the greater the strength of early fixations, the greater will be the later need for regression. The stronger the fixations on its path of development, the more readily will the function evade external difficulties by regressing to the fixations. The more incapable, therefore, does the developed function turn out to be of resisting external obstacles in its course. As in Freud's migration metaphor, when an individual who has passed through the maturational phases of development meets with persistent and intense frustration, one of the means of coping with the pain and lack of satisfaction is to revert from the more highly developed stages of mental organization to the modes of functioning typical of an earlier period. Wow, this book is so good. Okay, the falling back or regression will be to the phase of psychosexual development that have left areas of weakness, where the maturational step has been marked by unresolved conflicts and anxieties. Wow. Like the whole super childish nature of the left, how I've used the word hysterical. They do seem hysterical, and this explains potentially its roots and origins. They have regressed because they have been met with, when an individual who has passed through the maturational phases of development, so my peers, meets with persistent and intense frustration. One of the means of coping with the pain and lack of satisfaction is to revert from the more highly developed stages of mental organization, rational thought was my words, to modes of functioning typical of an earlier period. So these hysterical leftists are psychologically regressed. So when I call them retarded, I'm just being clinical. Oh, I just went from a highbrow place to a lowbrow place. Thank you. Nobody's going to watch this. Arrests of development or points of fixation occur in the sexual drive organization, ways of relating to people, fears of conscience, persistence of primitive kinds of gratification, and reacting defensively to old, no longer present dangers. Wow, this is fascinating. Okay, let's keep going. I'm gonna take a quick sip. Dude, this is so good, this book. Returning to the larger historical case of the German children of the First World War, it is Germany's Great Depression, with its unemployment, governmental chaos and impotence, and widespread anxiety about the future that constituted precisely such an external disturbance, as Freud describes. The early point of fixation was the First World War, when the peoples of Central Europe experienced prolonged hunger, war propaganda, the absence of fathers, and often both parents, and the bankruptcy of all political values and norms. So much of that can be applied to right now. We don't really have like prolonged hunger in the direct sense, but I do think we have a general state of deprivement, or a lot of, because we're not getting quality food, we're not getting quality connections, we don't have quality housing. So many people being a renter and barely being able to make rent, your needs are not met at a base functional level. And so I'm seeing, and then also like the bankruptcy of all political values and norms. Does that not outline today's day and age? The absence of fathers and mothers, they're working so much that they're not interacting with their children. There's so many parallels. And now we have a rise in collectivism, in socialism. So many people are like democratic socialists, or like straight out communists, or some variation of collectivists, of leftist collectivists. Wow. And we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. But that's on both sides. That's where it's interesting, because I see it on the left and the right. And I don't see a huge merger or unification. So I don't think Jews are in danger in America. I could be wrong, but also I do think maybe it's white men. We're kind of like the new devil. But anyways. The psychological symptoms of regression to phases of ego functioning fixed by the traumata of a childhood in war included responding to internal personal stress with externalized violence, projecting all negative anti-national or anti-social qualities onto foreign and ethnic individuals and groups, and meeting frustrations that would otherwise be tolerated with patience and rationally approached for solutions with a necessity for immediate gratification. The political expression of weakened egos and superegos that fostered regression was manifest not only in turning to violence, but most especially in the longing for a glorified and idealized but distant father who is all-knowing and all-powerful, who preaches the military virtues and permits his sons and daughters to identify with him by wearing a uniform and joining combat in a national cause. The seminal conceptual formulation of the generation as a force acting in history was established by Karl Mannheim in 1927 in his essay, The Sociological Problem of Generations. Here, Mannheim speaks of the human mind as stratified or layered, with the earliest experiences being the basis, and all subsequent experience building on this primary foundation and reacting against it. The influence of psychoanalytic thought on Mannheim's conceptualization of the problem is apparent. The human consciousness, structurally speaking, is characterized by a particular inner dialectic. It is of considerable importance for the formation of the consciousness which experiences happen to make those all-important first impressions. Childhood experiences in which follow to form the second, third, and other strata. Conversely, in estimating the biographical significance of a particular experience, it is important to know whether it is undergone by an individual as a decisive childhood experience or later in life superimposed upon the other basic and early impressions. Early impressions tend to coalesce into a natural view of the world. All later experiences then tend to receive their meaning from this original set, whether they appear as that set's verification and fulfillment or as its negation and antithesis. Mental data are of sociological importance not only because of their actual content, but also because they cause the individuals sharing them to form one group. They have a socializing effect. Mannheim then structures a further concrete nexus of generation in history as participation in the common destiny of the historical and social unit. That, I think, makes me think of the left, but also MAGA. I think, let me read that again, because that makes me think of MAGA and why people participate. And I'm kind of in that group, I think. Mannheim then structures a further concrete nexus of the generation in history as participation in the common destiny of the historical and social unit, and groups he terms generation units. Youth experiencing the same concrete historical problems may be said to be part of the same actual generation, while those groups within the same actual generation, which work up the material of their common experiences in different specific ways, constitute generation units. These are characterized by the fact that they do not merely involve a loose participation by a number of individuals in a pattern of events shared by all alike, though interpreted by different individuals differently, but an identity of responses, a certain affinity in the ways in which all move with and are formed by their common experiences. This means that those of a generation who experienced the same event, such as a world war, may respond to it differently. They were all decisively influenced by it, but not in the same way. Some became pacifists. Others embraced international Leninism. Some longed to return to the pre-war conservative, monarchist social order. All right, I might have to wrap up soon because I don't know if you can hear them. That's not gonna be good. Let me just get to the end of this paragraph. And the ones we are concerned with sought personal and national solutions in a violence-oriented movement subservient to the will of a total leader. What was politically significant in the early 1930s was the facility with which individuals of this generation moved from one allegiance to the other. Mannheim's point is that although the units of a generation do not respond to a formative crisis in the same way due to a multiplicity of variables, the overriding fact is that their response to that particular event. I'm going to reread that. I'm tired. I'm sorry. Mannheim's point is that although the units of a generation do not respond to a formative crisis in the same way due to a multiplicity of variables, the overriding fact is that their response to that particular event. That sentence just doesn't make sense. Because of this, they are oriented towards each other for the rest of their lives and constitute a generation. Oh my gosh. Nobody's going to watch this. I don't know why I do these readings. Just so other people think to read and collect old books. Yeah. Trump, MAGA, leftists. We got a lot of culty crap going on. Much love.